honestly, it was breathtaking to see that result. It was breathtaking to see that over 100,000 voters voted for uncommitted in the state of Michigan. You see people saying enough is enough.
This sort of idea of, okay, we have to vote for the Democrat to prevent Trump from coming into power, that's just going to keep leading to the same cycle again and again, where we have like the worst possible candidates on offer.
If we want to actually end U.S. military support, if we want to force an immediate and permanent ceasefire, we're going to need to be willing to take this movement farther beyond the primaries and start building an actual viable alternative to Biden and Trump and both of these warmongering capitalist parties. And that can only be done by starting to build an actual alternative through voting for third-party anti-war candidates in the general election.
Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Bia Lacombe.
And I'm Shama Sawant. Hundreds of thousands of people are voting uncommitted in the Democratic primary as a rejection of the terrible options being thrust on them with both Biden and Trump. This began in late February when over 110,000 people voted uncommitted in Michigan, tallying up to nearly 13% of the total vote, delivering a rebuke to Biden, mainly in anger at his support for the Israeli state's genocidal war on Gaza. On Tuesday this week, the Democratic Party predictably announced Biden as their nominee, which is not surprising in a race where the party's establishment made sure he had no real opposition. But the fact that so many among the Democratic Party's base cast uncommitted ballots instead of choosing Biden speaks volumes about the widespread anger at his administration. Michigan was particularly significant given that it is a battleground state between Trump and Biden. Trump won Michigan by fewer than 11,000 votes in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. Michigan activists, furious at Biden's support for the Israeli state's war on Gaza, got organized under the banners of Uncommitted and Abandon Biden. Since then, the momentum for uncommitted voting in the primary has grown, though not in a consistent manner. On March 5th, which was Super Tuesday, the uncommitted vote garnered over 12% in North Carolina and 19% in Minnesota. In Washington state, which is a mail-in ballot state, the initial result was relatively small, with 48,619 people, or 7.4%, voting uncommitted. This will likely grow as young people and left voters tend to send in their ballots later.
Opposition to the genocidal war on Gaza has been the single most important factor in driving the uncommitted vote. The number of Palestinians killed in Gaza has now surpassed 30,000 people, and the real number is likely much higher. There is widespread malnutrition and the threat that this brutal massacre could rapidly become yet more gruesome. Biden has blood all over his hands, because this massacre could not continue without the military aid and political support of U.S. imperialism.
And that has just brought the anger, I think, at him to a whole nother level. I think in a lot of ways it's been the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of people who already had lost confidence in him.
I mean, they did a poll recently and they showed 61% of all voters, independent, Republican, and Democrat, are against what Biden is doing and are calling for a ceasefire. It's as high as perhaps 70% of Democrats. So when your own party is telling you to do something and you're not listening to them, what's going to be the result?
The uncommitted vote tells me that many Americans deeply empathize with the plight of the Palestinians while also recognizing that those dollars for death and destruction are desperately needed at home for public schooling, for socialized health care, or for a workers' Green New Deal, affordable housing, and a whole host of other things.
If you haven't already, make sure to watch On Strike's coverage and analysis of the war on Gaza, including interviews with working people on the ground in Gaza and Israel. We are calling for a permanent ceasefire, end to all U.S. weapons shipments to Israel, an end to the brutal occupation, and for international working-class action in solidarity with the Palestinian people. But it's not only the war driving the growing opposition to Biden. In the absence of any other avenue for working and young people to push back against Biden and Trump, the Uncommitted and Abandon Biden movements are also helping to channel the frustrations of young people over many other things, such as the cost of living, piling household debt, and chronically underfunded social services.
I feel anxious about the election. I feel demoralized about the prospects of having either of them as president again.
I guess I just vote for one more just because I dislike the one the most. So it's not like either one is good.
It's tough, like 4 years ago, 8 years ago, it was kind of like the same thing, choosing the lesser of two evils in a way. It's very tiring to try to choose the lesser of two evils every 4 years.
I think a third party would be good because it's like you have to worry about Republicans, and then, you have to also worry about liberal president that, was kind of like saying, I will help you people. And then with what's happening with Gaza and kind of turning his back, they don't understand how we live. So, and I don't think that they ever will, and they don't really care.
And I think that has never been clearer than two senile old men running against each other, one of whom is slightly more virulently racist than the other one, both of whom are foaming at the mouth to do more genocide.
Before I had difficulty with accepting that reality, but now I feel like I'm past that point where I don't think I could check either box and go to bed at night feeling like I did my part.
New opinion polls released in the last weeks show that Donald Trump leads Biden nationally, including in many battleground states, as Biden's unstinted support for the war in Gaza continues to anger young people, Muslim and Arab Americans, and the progressive voter base of the Democratic Party.
It's very new for the Muslim community. We really haven't organized in this manner before, but it's not just the Muslims this time. It's people of humanity, people who care about what's happening in the world, people who care about human life that are coming together. It's not just based on what happened with Gaza, right? A lot of people are saying, well, it's this protest vote for. But what has Biden done with this money that we've given, right? And in New Jersey, $145 million goes to Israel each and every year for military aid. What has Biden done instead of solving the homeless problem, instead of helping us out with their healthcare costs, our high tuition costs, our infrastructure in America? People are frustrated with the increased costs of food. Recently, they said it costs the average American family $1,000 more to afford basic needs like gas and food and tuition, healthcare than it did prior to when Biden was the president. So he's failing on all fronts. It's not just the war. And people have to understand it's not just Muslims coming forth.
And the fact that Biden has already been nominated as the Democratic candidate, despite huge waves of anger, is a reminder that the Democratic Party is a party of war and big business, and efforts like Uncommitted are never going to lead to a reform of the Democratic Party, nor to any alternative candidate this year at the party's national convention.
So the big question is, what can working people and those opposed to the war on Gaza do to get organized in the lead up to November? Trump is now officially the nominee for the Republican Party. How do we defeat Trumpism and the right wing? How do we use the anger at Biden reflected in Uncommitted and Abandon Biden to build the movement for a new party for working people? Because we desperately need an alternative to the two warmongering parties of the billionaire class. What is the strategy for the anti-war protests in order to successfully force an end to the horrific war on the Palestinian people? What role does the labor movement have to play in all of this? How can working class power, particularly the power of strike action, be used to stand up against the war on Gaza and the ongoing attacks on working people's standards of living in the US? Before we get into all these important questions and what we believe the next steps should be for the Uncommitted movement, I want to remind you to like this video and subscribe to our channel and become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement. By becoming a Workers Strike Back member, you can also help On Strike continue to bring you coverage of a wide range of issues from a working class perspective you won't find on mainstream media. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people.
You're not alone, right? You're not just sitting on your couch, doom scrolling, reading all these different terrible news stories alone, that there are thousands and in reality millions of working class people who feel just as frustrated and also want to see a path forward, who know that higher wages, high quality healthcare, and high quality housing are totally possible.
We're building on the example of the past decade in Seattle on a national scale to widen and strengthen the class struggle. Who here wants to be a part of that movement?
Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member.
Including all the Democratic primaries through Tuesday, March 12th, Uncommitted has accumulated over 400,000 votes. Michigan activists organizing for the Uncommitted vote had a target of 10,000 votes, and they got 10 times that. What this shows is the massive anger at Biden and the strong desire for an alternative. But Michigan was far from the only state where activists and young people are seizing on the uncommitted tactic as a next step for the anti-war protest movement. Minnesota's 19% is the biggest vote so far for uncommitted. Organizers for the uncommitted vote in Minnesota said they had been aiming for 5,000 votes, a low target that was about double of what it was in the 2020 Democratic primary. What they ended up winning was nearly 46,000 votes. In North Carolina's Robeson County, where 38% of the population is Native American, 22% is Black, and 10% is Hispanic, the uncommitted total was 37%. This kind of result on the uncommitted ballot line is unprecedented. And it is a huge shift from 2020, when, for example, Michigan's Arab and Muslim community overwhelmingly supported Biden. In Dearborn, a city near Detroit, about 3/4 of voters supported Biden in 2020. As a result, he secured more than 30,000 votes from Dearborn alone, not including nearby cities that are also Arab American strongholds. Dearborn Mayor Abdullah Hammoud has said that for the Arab, Muslim, and young voters in the city, the Israeli state's war was, quote, issue number 1, 2, and 3, end quote. Since the Israeli attacks on Gaza began last year, Dearborn activists have organized a number of protests and other public events. There were also important developments in the labor movement around Uncommitted, including here in Washington state, where the Uncommitted effort was endorsed by 2 major unions, the United Food and Commercial Workers, or UFCW, Local 3000, which is the largest union in the state with 50,000 members, and the American Federation of Teachers. Among the upcoming states to watch closely for the uncommitted vote is New Jersey, which has its primary on June 4th, and which is home to 300,000 Muslims and 100,000 Arabs.
Biden has abandoned working people many times over. The massacre in Gaza, the withdrawal of COVID social programs like the child tax credit, the sellout on issues like the $15 an hour minimum wage, the blocking of the railroad worker strike, and more recently, the adopting of Trump's policies against immigrants and the overall undermining of working people's standards of living as the Biden-appointed Federal Reserve continues to raise interest rates and with them, the cost of housing. All of this is part of the support for Uncommitted and Abandon Biden, the support for third-party candidates in this election, and the widespread desire for a new party for working people. To be clear, from the point of view of worker strike back, while we support the Uncommitted and Abandon Biden movements as a vote against both Biden and Trump, we don't support the Democratic Party in any way, shape, or form. Worker Strike Back stands clearly for a new party for working people because neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party represents us. One of our first interviews on this broadcast was with left independent candidate Cornel West, who has a long history of opposing the brutal occupation of Gaza by the Israeli state. We still support his campaign, though we believe it is not nearly strong enough and will likely not be on the ballot in most states. We also support left independent candidate Jill Stein of the Green Party.
So despite the fact that, most people we talk to are really supportive of the platforms that West and Stein are running on, we nonetheless encounter this sort of skepticism of, well, yeah, it sounds like I have more agreement with them than I do with Biden, but I've never heard of them. I'm not sure if they could actually win. And this sort of lack of confidence on the basis that, unfortunately, there's not a real momentum right now behind either of these candidates' campaigns.
What I think I'd really like to see is someone like Cornel West or Jill Stein having, using that momentum to have a sort of grassroots element to their presidential campaigns and really fight.
We want both of these anti-war candidates to run much stronger campaigns than they currently are, so as to give a real alternative to working people on as many state ballots as possible in the general election in November. For example, we think they should use their campaigns to call protests demanding an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an end to all U.S. military aid to the Israeli state, and an end to the brutal occupation of Gaza.
It will not be enough for working people to say, I'm uncommitted and that I'm abandoning Biden right now in the primary. We need to also reject both Biden and Trump in November when it really counts.
I don't think it's a good strategy to only take, uncommitted or abandon Biden through the primaries. I think it really needs to extend to the general election or, you're not really putting Biden's feet to the fire at all, right? And that's how I think Biden doesn't want, a ceasefire. He doesn't want, to progress, to pass the progressive policies that he campaigned on for working people. The only way to get any concessions there is to, build a movement that can force him to. And I think just calling, through the primaries to kind of push Biden a little bit toward things like a ceasefire, toward things working people need, it's not an effective strategy because it's, ultimately not like an existential risk to Biden, right?
Very likely, a large majority of people who have voted and will vote uncommitted identify as Democrats. In fact, in most states, the only way to vote in the Democratic primary is to be registered as a Democrat. Though not in states like Washington, where you don't need a party affiliation to vote in the primary election. The uncommitted vote is far smaller in scale than the support for the Bernie Sanders campaigns in 2016 and 2020. An uncommitted vote in the primary does not, by itself, provide a way forward for the millions who are angry at Biden and also reject Trump. Nonetheless, the uncommitted vote is capturing the anger and discontentment and points very much toward the need for a new party. It is the latest expression of that urgent necessity.
There have been protests all across the country that millions of Americans have participated in against the war, but Biden's support continues. The war is about to hit its 5-month mark. And so I think people are looking for new ways, new avenues to express their opposition to Biden and their opposition to the war on Gaza. They want a way to express it that will actually be effective, that will actually force a change in policy. And voting against Biden in the primaries is, kind of a new tactic that the movement is taking up to try to increase pressure on him. But I think, again, it reflects more than just opposition to the war. It reflects a deeper loss of confidence in Biden and the Democrats that's been taking place over the course of his whole term so far in relation to primarily the cost of living crisis and the failure to stand up to right-wing attacks. And, now this anger about the support for the war is coming on top of all of that pre-existing anger.
We think that activists in states that have not had the primary election yet should still fight for the largest possible uncommitted vote, as a vote against both Biden and Trump. Beyond the primary, we think the people who voted uncommitted and those who didn't vote in the primary election at all, and who agree about the need for a new party for working people, should organize to win the biggest possible independent left vote in November, whether Cornel West or Jill Stein. Here in the Washington primary and in other cities across the country, Workers Strike Back members organized using a petition in support of the uncommitted movement, calling for a new party for working people and a vote for the strongest independent left candidate in November. We talked to many people who had already voted uncommitted or who agreed to do so.
One reason why November is so important is that most working and young people don't vote in the primary election. The votes for Bernie Sanders in both 2016 and 2020 were also unclear expressions of the need for a new party. Sanders, of course, ran in the Democratic primary. Bia and I are members of Socialist Alternative, which supported both of Bernie Sanders' campaigns. Bernie called for major increases in taxes on the wealthy, for a $15 an hour federal minimum wage, Medicare for all and canceling all medical debt, making college free and canceling student debt, and universal childcare and pre-K. We saw Sanders' campaigns as a very important expression of working class politics. But we also completely disagreed with his decision to run as a Democrat. Before Sanders made that decision in 2015, I shared a stage with him in New York City at the People's Climate March in the late summer of 2014. At that event, I strongly urged him to run as an independent. Socialist Alternative and I warned that the Democratic leadership would never allow Sanders to win, and they didn't. It's notable that the Democratic establishment feared and hated Bernie Sanders more than they feared the election of Donald Trump. The dedication of the Democratic elite to defeat Bernie Sanders was apparent again in 2020, even after working people had experienced firsthand the full brunt of the 4 years of a Trump presidency.
And again, in this year's election, if the Democratic Party leadership really wanted to prevent a Trump 2.0, they would not be trying to ram Biden, one of the most unpopular incumbent presidents in history, down the throats of working people. We also said in 2016 that if Sanders did win, he would come under tremendous pressure to bow to the Democratic leadership and capitalist class. And even though Sanders didn't win, we were right about our concerns about Sanders standing up to pressures from the Democrats. He supported Hillary Clinton in 2016 and later Joe Biden in 2020. And since the election of Biden, he has gone on to abandon his own political program and has given left cover to Biden. In one of the worst sellouts, Sanders refused to call for a ceasefire as the Israeli state was raining down death and destruction on the streets of Gaza last autumn. As we said before, There are no shortcuts. We need to build a new party for working people. Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and the Democratic Party's vicious attacks on working people and their loyalty to the billionaire class throughout their history are precisely what paved the way for Trump to be elected in the first place. And now, once again, Biden's failure to stand up for working people and his blatant warmongering are leading to the very real risk of Trump getting reelected. We warned that a lesser evil vote for those Democratic candidates against Trump would not stop Trumpism. And sure enough, right-wing populism has grown, in the form of Trump now leading in the polls in this election.
It's been Biden himself and his policies and actions over the course of his whole presidency that have caused this dramatic loss of support amongst the historic voting base of the Democratic Party. And if we continue to rely on him and the Democratic Party establishment as the force that's going to protect us against Trump, I mean, they have proven that they are not up to that task. They have proven that they are not able to win over and build the confidence of young voters, voters of color, immigrant voters, working class voters. They have had the opportunity over the last 4 years to prove themselves and show that they're able to build up a solid defense against Trump, and they've completely failed to do that. It's not because most Americans love Trump or agree with his positions on most things. It's because Biden and the Democrats have just so completely failed to offer any kind of viable alternative. Really, there is nothing that can stop this growth of support for Trump other than starting to build a party that actually addresses the things that are important to working people, that can actually win confidence and win support from working people, young people, people of color. It's not a job that we can put off any longer because we've seen what has happened to Trump's support. While we've been taking this strategy of relying on Biden and the Democrats, his support has grown. And if we want that trend to reverse, we need a new strategy. We need a strategy of actually winning support on the basis of a program that actually appeals to the interests of the majority of working class Americans. And if Biden's not going to do that, which he's not, then we need to start building up, a new party and support around third-party candidates who do support that type of program.
Only by getting organized to build a new party independent of big business and their political representatives, mobilizing in the streets, and exercising our collective power in the workplace through strike action can working people stop Trumpism and the right wing, U.S. government support for bloody wars like in Gaza and Ukraine, and win better standards of living for tens of millions of ordinary Americans.
And the main reason that workers should be involved is to organize and have discussions around these issues that are spotlighted in the election season, to openly challenge the idea that the far right or Trumpism can be defeated by the Democrats or by Biden. And most importantly, to do the hard work of building, financing, and recruiting for an independent party right now and not putting that off again and again until tomorrow. Because ultimately it will take mass movements and an organized mass movements to halt the endless U.S. spending going to Israel to support the war.
Every year that the task of building a new party for working people is postponed, the threat of Trumpism and the right wing will continue to grow. And there will be new figures more dangerous even than Trump. In India, where I grew up, there is currently a much more right-wing regime in power in the central government with the Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The sister organization to the BJP, called the RSS, has historical links to the Nazis. Modi himself oversaw the massacre of Muslims in the western Indian state of Gujarat in 2002 when he was the chief minister of that state. Modi and the BJP have gone much farther than Trump did when he was president, with brutal crackdown on activists, attacks on Muslims and oppressed caste people, and a chilling effect on the media. But the reason for Modi's rise to power is fundamentally very similar to that of Trump's. The closest equivalent of the Democratic Party in India is the Congress Party, which carried out decades of neoliberal attacks on working and oppressed people in India and is widely and correctly seen as corrupt. There are, in fact, many other large political parties in India, but not a single party which fights for working people. And so the space was opened wide for Modi and the BJP. Working people need to build new parties of our own in the United States and globally. And in the US, that means ending all support for the Democratic Party. Voting uncommitted in the primary and for Biden in November would be yet another failed attempt at a shortcut. Biden and the Democrats really don't like any challenge to their domination and hate even protest votes in the primary.
But what they really fear is working and young people refusing to support them in November. It's no accident that the corporate media relentlessly attacks left independent candidates, like they did Ralph Nader in his runs, and as they have already done this year with Cornel West and Jill Stein. Even here in Seattle, where the city council has been thoroughly dominated by Democrats for decades, Shrema was relentlessly attacked for the 10 years that she was the only socialist city council member. We should take that as our cue. The corporate liberal media desperately wants to reinforce the status quo. It's unclear how much momentum Uncommitted will be able to continue to develop, given that Biden has already secured the Democratic nomination. Millions of people will still vote, and most states have not held their primaries yet, but the clinching of the nomination could lower turnout overall. There is a potential for protests at the Democratic National Convention, and those could be important. And a big uncommitted vote paired with a major organizing effort for those protests could be a very powerful combination. However, working people should have no illusions that simply accumulating uncommitted delegates is where our power lies. Working people have a stake for the largest possible vote for uncommitted, not because it would block Biden at the Democratic Convention. It won't. But fighting for the biggest possible uncommitted vote would make sense if it was used as a way to build momentum for a new party for working people. A concrete expression of the next step, then, would be to organize for the largest possible vote in November for independent left anti-war candidates Cornel West and Jill Stein. We should also heed the lessons from 2016, when the Democratic primary was rigged against Bernie Sanders. With the Democratic National Committee actively organizing against him, maneuvering in a series of state caucuses and primaries, and with the corporate media and quote-unquote progressive Democratic figures leading waves of blistering, dishonest attacks against him. We cannot have any faith at all in the Democratic Party, its primary, or its convention.
It's unfortunate that there isn't far wider organizing around the country for voting uncommitted now and against Biden and Trump in November as a means to help build the momentum for a new party for working people. A majority of Uncommitted's leadership specifically want to orient supporters to vote for Biden in November, which will ultimately be a betrayal of working people and everyone who wants an end to the war on Gaza.
The position that Socialist Alternative and Workers' Strike Back are taking around Uncommitted is unique. The other forces that are helping to organize this campaign are taking an approach of wanting to put pressure on Biden in the primaries so that he will hopefully improve his position in relation to the war on Gaza before the general election so that he will have a better chance of defeating Trump in the general. For them, it's very clearly an effort to improve Biden as a candidate. I believe one of the quotes on the website is, "We want to force Biden to earn our votes." But again, with the goal of ultimately uniting then an even stronger coalition of support behind Biden in the general election. And we think that that strategy, unfortunately, is a really dangerous strategy because we don't think that there is a real chance of fundamentally changing Biden's position on the war through this tactic.
Building a new party will take hundreds of thousands of people getting active to organize for it, bringing forward concrete demands like those Workers' Strike Back is fighting for. A real race for working people, including a $25 an hour minimum wage, for good union jobs for all, to fight racism, sexism, and all oppression, for quality, affordable housing and free healthcare for all, and lastly, no more sellouts. We need a new party. Winning these demands, defeating Trumpism and the right wing, and building a new party for working people will require building a fighting labor movement in the United States, which is why we launched Workers' Strike Back early last year. The labor movement has taken some initial steps to support the Uncommitted and Abandon Biden movements. We mentioned UFCW 3000 and AFT endorsing Uncommitted in Washington state. This is good, but the leadership of both these unions have also contradicted themselves completely by already having endorsed Biden. What does it mean for these labor leaders to call for Uncommitted at the same time they undemocratically force through an endorsement for Biden without a vote by the rank and file?
I think it's really disappointing, like when UFCW represents grocery workers, nurses, predominantly younger, workforce who we're all working, under these horrible conditions. And then like, yeah, Biden, of course, like not forgiving student debt is huge to my coworkers, right? And I imagine for like nurses, like we know how much it costs to go to nursing school. They are also like feeling the brunt of that, like now, especially now that payments are due. There has been no further stimulus, and like, yeah, wages are not keeping up with the inflation that we've seen, like completely out of scale. It's like clear that the rank and file that like my union represents is not being represented by Biden. So then for them to in turn say, oh, but we have to support Biden because it's not Trump is just like really hollow.
Rank and file members of the labor movement should organize to pass resolutions around the country rejecting support for both Biden and Trump. These resolutions should call for a new party for working people and point toward the concrete next steps needed. Major unions like the UAW, whose members won real gains last year through a historic strike action, have passed resolutions calling for a ceasefire. In total, American labor unions already calling for a ceasefire represent over 9 million union members, more than half of the nation's unionized working class. But as we said before, a serious strategy to end the war immediately raises the need for the labor movement to break from Biden and the Democratic Party. The leadership of many of the same unions that have publicly called for a permanent ceasefire, including prominent ones like the UAW, have rapidly turned around and endorsed Biden, the warmonger-in-chief, throwing away the massive potential leverage they could exert on him in the context of a closely contested election. This type of undermining by the leadership of mass workers' organizations stymies the anti-war movement. By failing to present a serious threat to warmongering politicians, the movement is left treading water. Rank-and-file union members should demand that their leadership refuse to send another dime to Biden and the Democrats. The $27 million unions spent to support Biden's campaign in 2020 would have made a huge difference in the effort to build a new party of, by, and for working people.
My dues are going to fund these people's campaigns when they say all these things, they parade around as progressives, and then they turn around and like stab us in the back. As far as like how do we then like change the course of like these events and all these procedures and all this like, oh, song and dance. It's going to take like real organized rank and file action of saying like, no, like you're not going to endorse these people. Like we're not going to let you. We're going to endorse this other candidate who actually is following through with their promises, like whatever it may be, but just like preventing these bad cycles like of repeating all the time, like in unions.
I think another important thing is that our labor movement could be pointing away from this dead-end approach of just asking the Democrats again and again, giving them our money, giving them our votes, and hoping that they will stop Trump or will help to win progress for workers, better wages and conditions. And the way out of that could be for the labor movement to start endorsing, as a step toward building a labor party, a party for workers, could endorse left progressive independent candidates that run with no money from big business and without the influence of either big business or the capitalist parties of the Republicans and Democrats. And those would be candidates like Cornel West or Jill Stein of the Green Party. And I think UAW endorsing these left independent candidates could be a real movement changer, a real game changer, could have a real powerful effect and bring some legitimacy to these ideas. A huge barrier for people voting third party in the U.S., independent candidate in the U.S., is the idea that it is a dead end, that it can't win, that it has no effect. That's absolutely wrong. And I think labor can play, and has in the past played, and has internationally played a really, really important role in showing that way forward.
Check workersstrikeback.org for a sample resolution that you can use in your union. And join us at an upcoming meeting, including here in Seattle, to discuss the strategy for next steps.
I wanted to let our viewers know that you might see me a little less regularly in the next few months. I'm working on a book and have a deadline approaching. We will cover the subject of the book, The Fight Against Caste Oppression, in an upcoming episode. We will also be bringing new co-hosts onto the show whom you will recognize from past segments so that On Strike can continue to be the dynamic show that it has become since we launched last September. On Strike is a production of Workers Strike Back, a nationwide organization fighting on the working class demands we mentioned earlier. Find out more at workersstrikeback.org and donate. And look for us on Patreon to support our work. On Strike is a broadcast entirely for working people and funded entirely by working people. Solidarity.